morning, everybody.
Buongiorno.
Buongiorno.
Welcome to a podcast about buildings and cities. I'm Luke Jones.
I'm George Kinjal.
And you join us for a fun, frolicsome romp through the very long life of a sort of not all that famous but quite interesting 20th century architect.
And we've been to some of his buildings, which is good, which is how we can talk about him.
So Giovanni Michelucci, he really is a 20th century architect in the sense that he lived through almost the whole thing. Born in Pistoia in 1891 and dying 3 days shy of his 100th birthday in 1990. The reasons for doing him are that, we've been to quite a lot of his buildings, which is quite important. He's produced some very interesting work, particularly towards the latter end of his life, but he also lived and practiced through all these kind of surreal transitions, being born 4 years after Le Corbusier, so really part of that generation of modernist patriarchs.
But it also means born squarely into an architectural era which is pre-modern.
It kind of ran the gamut from a style which is very distinctly pre-modernist, kind of starting off pretty much in the neo-Baroque Art Nouveau sort of transition, and ending up in something which is kind of postmodern, or at least it does an awful lot of things that you would associate with that.
Yeah. He goes through soft modernism, hard modernism, and then into his own strange late style, which... Yeah, well, I think that we will in later episodes deal with what the postmodern is or isn't.
So he was born in Pistoia, which is a city to the northwest of Florence.
Yeah, it's in this industrial... There's a little plain surrounded by mountains, which is heavily industrialised, but also has a few ancient cities in it. And they're all really a sort of a conurbation, and it's right at the other end of Florence. And it's traditionally a centre of iron and metalworking. Possibly pistol. The word pistol comes from Pistoia.
And indeed, his family were producers of architectural metalwork, and he, as a young man, came into contact with the world of architecture, and particularly the practitioners of the then fashionable Liberty style.
But this is... by Liberty, they really mean Art Nouveau.
Yeah. It's called Stile Liberty, and rather improbably, it's named after the department store in London.
Well, like people say Liberty style, yeah.
You know, the Art Nouveau style is associated with a lot of pretty extravagant decorative metalwork, and his family were making quite a lot of it for some of the big architects of the period.
The Italian style is a little different. Some really great buildings in northern Italy. It's a sort of time Italy was a very economically divided society, and the new sort of bourgeois industrialists, along with a load of weird like English and German aristocrats, were building these kind of mad villas for themselves.
Yeah, we've definitely run into them. I mean, even in Florence, there were some that I saw, and they run the gamut a bit. There are some which are, a sort of Art Nouveau historicist fusion. Yeah. And there are some which are very, very orthodoxly Art Nouveau, and which you could imagine being in Belgium or somewhere like that. I find it funny that their version of the style has an English name, because it's really not a big style in England at all, and it's really quite a big
really
thing there.
In England.
Yeah, it's sort of sublimated.
Was really a carpet merchant.
Yeah, it was named after, somehow the style got its name from the fabric that they were selling in Liberty or something.
But the historic, the flamboyantly camply historic is much stronger than you would think if you were thinking of the Paris Metro or Macintosh, or some of it's really cool. I think it's I really love the daring and enterprise, and they're definitely things. Sometimes I think they're terrible, and sometimes I think they're absolutely brilliant.
Should we just sort of have a bit of a drift through the early life and career?
Yep, he studied in Florence.
And then he got married. I think he made a successful marriage to a well-connected woman called Eloisa Pacini, and basically found his way into the right sort of circles to be able to start getting some good commissions during the 20s, and became in his 30s a pretty successful architect.
Nowadays, it's pretty unusual for someone to get a major public commission in their early 30s or even in their late 20s, but it did happen back then.
I find it difficult to really locate what he's about.
Well, the very early ones are not that great. The style is, if you can imagine like merging the very stripped back approach to historic, but with a little bit of the last bits of historicism and a little bit of deco, really, a bit of like rich materials, marble and things.
I'm also not totally clear what happened to him during the war. Like he did participate, but
yeah, I don't know at all. Perhaps we should find out. I mean, it's not something that could pass you by without you noticing. The First World War in Italy, we don't think of them as a major power, but they engaged for pretty basically for irredentist reasons. They wanted to get the coast of Croatia, what's now Croatia, which was then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and fought like horrifically bloody battles in the Alps, and also every now and again the Austrians would break through and despoil the Po Valley. The country's economy wasn't really strong enough to sustain this, and huge numbers of people died in a kind of classically First World War type way, and the country was really run down and emerged out of it with very little to show for it, really. They got Trieste and some mountains in the Alps.
In the biographical sketches, this is all this early stuff is somewhat elided up until the point where he moves to Rome in 1926. And something quite significant had happened before then, which is probably worth pointing out, which is that Mussolini had come to power in 1923.
1922. So, I mean, if you want the very, very quick history of the country was in a bad state after the First World War, all the arms industries were laid off, a lot of people had died, there's all these demobbed soldiers around the place, and the economy is crashing, and there were lots and lots of strikes, and it was clear the old order wasn't really working. There was a big change in the constitution where, right after the war, in order to recognise the suffering of the soldiers, they gave universal male suffrage. Before, Italy had been run with elections and, a parliament, but it was on a very limited franchise, and they were all very broad coalitions of the different types of bourgeois party, and and the government changed every 18 months or something and fell all the time, except for a period earlier with the tyrannical Francesco Crispi, who is the sort of prototype for Mussolini, and launched an attack on Ethiopia. But apart from that, there were lots and lots of sort of essentially what they call liberal, which means
middle class,
bourgeois interest. Yes, it means economically laissez-faire Christian Democrat. Anyway, after the war, lots of strikes, lots of demobbed soldiers. Mussolini had been a journalist in the pre-war period, initially a socialist. Has a breaking up with this. I mean, in a very, very successful editor newspaper. He's great tabloid populist newspaper editor, and that was what really he did all the way through his career. Was that sort of? It's a bit like if the country was run by the editor of the Sun or something.
What I mean, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, even more so. Anyway, and he had a breaking with the socialists because he was really pro-war, like the futurists all were. It's the hygiene of society, the only truly creative force. So he was very pro that, and he comes back and he gets very involved in. Is it called squadismo? Where rather like the Fry Corps, you had all these like gangs of soldiers beating up on strikers and strikers beating up on gangs of soldiers, sort of left versus right. And he somehow manages, using a newspaper that he'd been given by the French during the war, to kind of get himself in as a figurehead with very limited control over these people, the sort of right-wing militia, and demands that in 1922 that the government makes him the prime minister so that he can bring the squads into line and deal with all the striking and people that are trying to take the land off the landholders and things. And basically the Liberals agree to it, and then he stages this big march to Rome as a sort of fake putsch. He doesn't even go on it himself. He just turns up at two places and have pictures of himself taken, and is duly elected in. And that starts the fascist period. And then slowly over the next sort of 10 years, he takes control. There's a big act passed which changes the electoral rule, whereby the party that gets the most votes gets 2/3 of all of the members of parliament. which is pushed through by the liberals, the church, and sort of the other conservative influences. And essentially that means that he can do whatever he wants. And then he sets about murdering the socialist leaders. It's not like Germany where they kill really large numbers of people. There's a lot of, it's more like the mafia. And he's always, all the way through his career, really concentrating the core of efforts on the press.
So I think we are into then the fascist period, and I think that the first two major buildings, and the ones which are worth talking about a bit, are both during the 1930s, by which time Michelucci was about 40.
The culture of fascist Italy is far more fruitful than that of any of the other totalitarian states. Unlike in Stalinist Russia or Nazi Germany, there's genuine, like, Stalinist architecture is all pretty well all bad. Nazi architecture is not great. The art is all terrible.
It's much more diverse. It's sort of contested, and it explores in a way which certainly appears quite kind of critical and fruitful the relationship between modernity, industry, production, the city, history, and the different tendencies within the period are sort of staking out different positions. There are two problems. On the one hand, the architecture is genuinely demands to be taken seriously. On the other hand, it's definitely also fascist. So there have at various times been attempts to create a little bit of distance between the buildings as things in themselves and the ideology of the period that they were produced in. But I don't think you can really do that.
I would say it's like this. Architects were largely either happy to sign up to fascism or just sign up to the powers that be. The reason why Italian culture was so much more vibrant than it was in the other totalitarian states is because the fascist government didn't really dictate culture. And what you have in architecture is a very broad range of basically all the schools that were present before, from at the one end, sort of wacky avant-garde modernist type people, sort of century, pseudo history, light history, right into the liberty and mock baroque, all competing to be the fascist style of architecture. Building is a very fascist Italian thing. It's very difficult to define what the Italian fascists were about, but infrastructure they like. They like the fact that everyone is brought together. It's great for employment. It's a fantastic sort of gesture of the power of the state. They love building railways and motorways and monuments and all that stuff, and they're built all over the country because it's very politically important. But they're built in all sorts of different styles. But lots of those styles are kind of, in one sense, very convincingly fascist.
Yeah, absolutely. And even those, so within the various tendencies, you have at one end, you have sort of quite wacky avant-gardes, and you also have the rationalists who are very much admirers and followers of Le Corbusier in various ways. And at the other end, you do have people who are kind of straightforwardly reactionary. I think that all of them were able to articulate kind of key aims of the regime within the way that their architecture, within the kind of architectural resolution of the things that they were creating. So even the rationalists, whose work is expressed in a very abstract way, it's still expressing, it still sets out to express kind of fundamental historical truths which are about kind of hierarchy, and which have a kind of a relationship to a kind of imagined history which is all about like the glory that was Rome and these kinds of things. I think that it's worth just labouring the point that it's really quite different from Germany. You can see very clearly the difference in the position of avant-gardists within those regimes. So I think to his lasting shame, Mies van der Rohe, after all of his Jewish and socialist colleagues had to flee the Bauhaus in Germany, tried to stick around and pick up some commissions from the new regime, and was unable to do so. There was absolutely no space for someone working in that kind of mode within Nazi Germany. Someone like Giuseppe Terragni, who we'll talk about a bit more about in the bonus, like absolutely was able to build buildings like the Casa del Fascio in Como, which is like absolute purist, stark form, but which is the headquarters of the fascist party in that city. It's an absolutely modernist building. The other thing is that there is something inherently different about within fascism, there's always a sort of nostalgic object, but in Italian fascism, it's Rome, which is a city, which is like the great metropolis of the ancient world, whereas in Nazi Germany, it's sort of an imagined, non-urban kind of peasant existence. The like trope which comes up again and again is civiltà. They're always talking about civilization, Italian civilization. For the Nazis, it's all folk. It's folk and land. Whereas, civilization is explicitly about cities.
I think there's a very complicated thing, but I think we should talk about it in the bonus.
He has these two big commissions, and so a lot of this had come about through his wife. I think he fell in with the circle of this guy called Marcello Piacentini, who's the big sort of court architect of the era, and who makes it easier for him to get commissions. He wins with a group of other youngish architects, broadly rationalistically aligned, the commission for the new station in Florence.
Yeah, the way this worked was he was in his mid-30s, I think, when he did enter the competition, and he was supported by half a dozen other architects, none of whom were over the age of about 23, and he led this team with a lot of political backing. If you just say rationalism, you might think of it as being something like Hans Meyer, or the buildings are quite classical and rich and expressive and almost deco-y.
Well, this one is deco, yeah. What was said to be one of the virtues of the competition is that, in terms of its context, it's very close to, and is named after this church, which has a facade by Alberti, doesn't it? Yeah. It kind of steps down from the height of the train shed.
And it creates a huge public space, huge sloping, non-piazza-like public space in the front, which has now got a massive hole in it going down to this insane underground car park with a huge pool at the bottom, which I think can't have possibly been part of the original proposal. It must have been done at some point.
Yeah, these sort of big masses, but which step down, and the lower mass very much has that kind of Art Deco-y sense of bending, planar movement. And then the whole thing is cut through by this ribbon of glass, which is expressed vertically. So there's a big vertical stripe that comes down the facade, and which actually is running across the roof as well, and creating the space of the main ticket hall, comes down the facade and then comes across the lower part in front of it and then down that again, and which sort of slices through the two of them.
The interior is sort of three big rooms. You've got the room of the platforms, and then you step down a little bit into this big concourse with a sort of glass deco-y roof, which has also got all these kind of lovely deco-y kind of kiosk intrusions. And you can go sideways out and in, and then forward into a much smaller kind of lobby in a very tall sort of marble proportioned. It's clearly very much more modern style than earlier train stations, but it's still picking up their ideas of classical beauty, high proportion.
It's clearly a product of the machine age, but then it's perplexingly realised in all of these rather beautiful, very historic feeling materials. So the facade is what? Is it travertine? What is the facade? It's this very orange kind of pitted stone. And then on the interior, you have all of these beautiful, quite either plain or figured marbles. All of the fittings are these very weighty bronze fittings, which are now highly kind of patinated and going green. Yes, it's a funny mixture between. You can certainly see the kind of romanità. It has this massiveness, this weightiness. It has the materials are absolutely the materials of Imperial Rome, but perplexingly kind of put through this Art Deco sort of filter.
The materials of Tuscan Gothic. There's the green and white marble striped floor, and it knows where it is, but it also has lots of futurist light fittings, and it has big gestures, but there aren't very many of them.
It has slightly the air of a retro-futuristic project, in that it seems to belong in this indefinable way to something between several different recognizable historical eras. It's a strange fusion which is in this ambiguous place between a historicist language and a futuristic language from the distant past. You can imagine a kind of a film or a comic book or something producing this as a fantastical setting.
But I think a lot of the architecture produced in the interwar period does have that feeling.
It sort of spans the kind of ideological breadth of the sort of fascist imagination, isn't it? Because it contains both history as a comforting, nostalgic place, and also the promise of a glittering new era, which is going to be bought by technology and also probably by a certain amount of war.
Speed, light, machine, spiritual renewal, one of their very favourite and most vague things, and blood.
So this demonstrates a little bit about the way in which architectural culture worked in relation to the leader. I think in 1932, the design had been unveiled but not yet built, I think. And there were a number of other ongoing major projects. And 2 reactionary deputies made speeches criticising in very strong terms both the design of the station at Santa Maria Novella and also the design of a new town called Sabaudia, which was one of the ones built in the plain of Lazio, where they'd done all these drainage works. And that was a moment where Mussolini did choose to intervene, and he slapped down the deputies, and he gave this speech to the architects where he said, young architects, addressing in particular these 7 young architects, you should not be afraid to be bold. Which is sort of funny, strange, contradictory phrasing. There's an earlier controversy involving the rationalists where he very pointedly doesn't intervene at all and he lets them fight it out. But on this one, because the projects are to some extent identified with him, he chooses to intervene, he backs them up. But it's all really, the calculus is all about, well, in this case, it matters to me. I need to stamp my authority on this, so I'm coming in on their side here. But when previously given an opportunity to come in on the side of kind of broadly aesthetically progressive, as it were, architecture, he had abstained. And it's entirely, the calculus is just what suits him at the time. But it's an important moment. So
one other thing I wanted to say, which is about the subsequent legacy of these buildings, which is that all of these buildings, the Florence train station included, were originally covered in fascist symbols. They were encrusted in fasces and axes all over the facades. There's lots of bits, and that's all taken off, and they become immediately completely desacralized in a way that you cannot imagine. I mean, there are still quite a lot of Nazi buildings built in that period that are not thought of as, but the ones which have a symbolic attachment
basically had to be destroyed. Yeah,
a certain number of them certainly did, and they certainly. The spirit of Nazism has much more hung over them. Very few people think, if they're not really thinking about it, of that train station as a fascist monument.
Although the group was identified with the rationalist movement, as you say, this one doesn't quite really, it doesn't fit into the mainstream of what that was about.
The movements are much more fluid than you'd think. The Italians seem to show terrifically more, not all of them, but most of them, terrifically more doctrinal flexibility than their northern counterparts, who would often take they produced absolutely prodigious quantities of manifestos and opinions on everything, but were all seen to be very capable of doing something completely different the next day.
The other really big project, which he's a participant in, again as part of a team, although in this time he designs one of the buildings in his own name, is the University of Rome. And this was led by Piacentini, who made the overall plan and who designed the administrative building. Michelucci's big contribution is the Institute of Mineralogy. So in this one, you see what had developed so this is like in the early 30s. The regime has got as close as it's ever going to get to having a kind of a defined style, which is very stripped back classicism, like almost as stripped back as you can possibly imagine it. And Michelucci's building is very much within that style. It should be said that not everybody who designs a building for the university did remain within that style, and there were not even all of them used the same materials. There are some brick ones as well as some stone ones.
The style, which is a very pared back classicism, I feel, you might disagree with me, evolves out of a movement, I guess, right after the war, which is, it feels like it's influenced by several things, one of which is approaches to history. The earlier antecedents feel like they're very informed by the empty industrial city and the way in which that's like the empty, ruinous Rome, kind of mediated through essentially the paintings of De Chirico, or his idea of Turin. Turin was the city which was the capital of Piedmont, which was the bit of Italy that unified the rest, and it was one of the most technologically advanced, and the most technologically advanced city that didn't have, like Milan, which was another advanced city, but Milan had this huge, historic, ancient city of hundreds of thousands in the Roman period. This idea of this empty, historical, slightly sepulchral, timeless, powerful, eternal Italy. The squareness and sort of rigidity of the windows, which could be any, it could be almost could be London, it almost could be Senate House, and it almost could be.
Oh yeah, it's very much of the same moment as Senate House, isn't it? I mean, Senate House actually. So this is a building in Bloomsbury for the University of London. It feels it's one of the most surreally out of place buildings in London.
But the Italian ones feel to me, the windows, stately and dark, feel a bit more also like these great Roman massed walls with their, gaping eye sockets. Yeah, they also feel like the dark windows of De Chirico. Muzio earlier had explicitly said, this is a metaphysical building responding to metaphysical painting. Metaphysical painting is essentially the movement around De Chirico.
I don't really have that much to say about Michelucci's building in this one. It seems very contextual. I think that the best buildings of this ensemble are the ones by the one by Pagano, I think is which is in brick, which is much more of a kind of rationalist building, which looks it's very ahead of its time in the sense that it seems to arrive at this quite polite form of slightly historicised modernism that now feels like it belongs in a city in Holland somewhere.
From the 50s.
Yeah, absolutely. But with very beautifully, lovely bricks. Very crisp,
but with the white marble wrapping round in parts.
Yes, sort of just a little bit of edge.
Penetrated by the Whereas the Michelucci ones are much more standard. They've got these gigantic. They've got the sort of gigantic order of glass strip windows going into flat facades,
which I think is not all that interesting. Actually, I think I even probably prefer Piacentini's one, which is the rather sinister, top-heavy administrative building where there's this like very heavy mass of masonry with no windows in at the top, but which gives it a little bit of a sense of having an enormous forehead, like one of the psychic children in Akira or something. It's got, I think I can see a bit where some of the expressive potential that Aldo Rossi I think enjoys using of awkwardness is being arrived at in some of these buildings.
I think there's a very clear connection between the mythic history and industrial ruin language of Aldo Rossi and of this style and period of architecture.
And he had lots of other buildings. He had there's a quite big building in Arezzo for the government he built.
Municipal one.
Yeah, sort of in the same style. It's got an arcade with these very abstract like arches, like totally flat round arches, which are very much a feature of that's very much the house style of fascist architecture.
And exactly like De Chirico paintings. And I'm very familiar with them from all the ministries in Albania were done at this period and in exactly that style.
But anyway, it doesn't end well.
No, fascism doesn't end well.
So in 1936 they invaded Ethiopia.
Yeah, he was always planning. War is essential to Italian fascism, because Italian fascism is basically whatever Mussolini believes in, and Mussolini has got, rather like the futurists, this notion that really society is for war. Society is for masculine virtue, particularly his masculine virtue, and that reaches its moment of quintessence in war. And so he was planning to go with war with Hitler. He was planning to go with war with Austria. He was fighting a war in support of Franco-Spain. He was thinking of going to war with France. He thought briefly of going to war with the British Empire. But he ends up going to war with Ethiopia, which was probably a sensible move, and then Greece.
But well, and then they were sanctioned by the League of Nations, and then
They were sanctioned by the League of Nations for intervening. They were sanctioned very heavily for intervening in the Spanish Civil War, which was the first big military adventure. But it really made no difference. Rather like now, when there's lots of other neighbouring countries who are perfectly happy to go around it. In the run-up to the Second World War, from the point of view of Italy, Mussolini kind of is realizing that he's more powerful and starting to be a bit more crazy. He bans handshakes. Everyone's got to do the Roman salute. Tries to punish people for using lei, the formal tense. Tries to ban the formal tense. And various other things like that, which people think are nuts. And he's starting to get a bit unpopular. He waits around to see if Hitler's going to win before entering the war. Decides it's going to be a short, sharp victory for Hitler. Gets involved in the war.
History repeats itself, isn't it? This is the Italian thing: is to wait and then make a bad decision. Yeah.
Well, they picked the right winners, but it really wasn't very helpful in the First War. Their participation in the war is a bit of a fiasco because they just are not. The Italian economy is just not the German economy. They are not that developed. They don't. Mussolini, unlike Hitler, really isn't a detail man when it comes to the army. Hitler was absolutely obsessed with getting his army up to, the quality that he wanted. And Mussolini essentially is a headline writer. He made himself 8 ministers, and also believed he could speak fluent French and German. So whenever he was conducting treaty negotiations, would refuse to have interpreters. Which had exactly the consequences you would expect. Their participation in the war is a fiasco, and when the south of Italy is invaded in 1943, the King of Italy removes him as leader, which was possible in the constitution. The Supreme Council of Fascism gets rid of him. There's a sort of anti-coup, and Italy surrenders, and the Nazis invade in the north and prop him up for a bit. And then he's eventually captured by partisans north of Milan and is shot and strung up outside a petrol station in the main square in Milan.
Yes, very futuristic.
And that was that, as they say. And after all, there's a bit of chaos in it.
Yeah, it's been a bit of a mess. So for returning to our hero, now in his he was 54. Kind of approaching old age, actually.
Or a young architect.
Yeah.
54 was quite credible young architect.
And he was surveying in Florence, a city which had been pretty significantly damaged. It's not really visible now, but there was an enormous amount of damage, and he produced a lot of drawings. He would go around kind of drawing the ruins. There are lots and lots of these drawings of buildings which have been destroyed, which
I mean we've obviously glossed over an enormous amount of suffering and horror that occurred in Italy in the war. It wasn't a good time. It devastated the country.
So he gets into his post-war career. I think most architects were just able to kind of get straight back into practicing again. There are one or two who were disgraced and had to give it up or leave the country.
They largely had to, rather like Speer was very involved in activities that weren't architectural.
Yeah.
You had to have really been involved. If you were just involved in architecture, you'd be fine. If you were involved in grassing loads and loads of people up to the SS and supporting the Nazis, you were not very fine. But most people hadn't. Almost all architects had sworn an oath to Mussolini. Basically, if you want to be a member of any professional body, you have to swear an oath of allegiance to Mussolini, and everyone did.
Yeah, so this, I think, is when we get onto some quite interesting buildings. So kind of going into this later part of his career, he returns to teaching, which he'd been doing. And the buildings which he's involved in are largely churches, and they're largely churches which had been destroyed and which are being rebuilt. When I was doing my notes for them, I kept kind of referring to them as these kind of penitent churches. And that's pure projection on my part, but what that evoked for me is the sense that their materiality is quite austere. They tend to be made of masonry, often kind of not fully sort of shaped blocks. The structure is concrete, but quite rough, somewhat agricultural. sometimes the concrete frame is somewhat expressed in a way which is a little bit reminiscent of the architecture of Auguste Perret, which is happening roughly the same time. What details they have tend to either be these interesting figurations of structure, or else these quite simple, repeated details to do with the transmission of light to the inside of the building. And so there's a sequence of 4 of these churches, which are all in and around that area. He did a tiny little one in a place called Collina di Pontelungo. He did a bigger one, which we've been to visit, called the Church of Santa Maria e Tecla in Pistoia. And then he did a couple of other ones, another even bigger one in a place called Laudarello, and another tiny one. Should we say something about the one that we went to see?
Yeah, I think we can. There's things you could say about all of them, I suppose. And also, he was doing lots of other buildings. He seems to have had a very successful career at this time. There's some great office buildings and some lovely sort of. He was obviously someone you brought in to work with historic buildings as well.
I was just going to say, in case we haven't stressed it before, it's pretty evident that he was a bit of an operator. He was clearly socially very good at getting on with people. He knew how to do all of the things that you need to do to get jobs and be in the position to win commissions, which are not purely just about being good at architecture.
Yeah, but actually his building, the quality has been improving steadily.
He's only had, there's some nice ones. I mean, he'd only had to build like 30 or 40 up until this point to really be getting quite good at it.
Very diverse in style. I want to start briefly mention a couple of things from the non-religious buildings before I talk about the churches, which is that they are essentially fruity modernist, square-based, but with a rich material palette, and they're much better than the pre-war ones. They're becoming much looser. There's much more use of style and form than there were earlier on. They're quite unarticulated and a bit boring, with the exception of the train station. The churches are very different in the overall form, strongly taking from historical references. The first one that you mentioned, the small one, strongly resembles, in fact, an Orthodox church or a church that would have been built, just after the fall of the Roman Empire.
Whether or not this is really the case, they certainly give the impression of almost having been rebuilt from the stones of the previously destroyed structure.
But they're entirely made of industrial material, so that the one we visited is a concrete frame and like light industrial bricks. But it takes the shape of this sort of imagined basilica on a hill with these tiny slit windows, a concrete frame truss roof, which is exactly like old St. Peter's or one of those ancient Roman basilicas, but with concrete replacing wood in the roof. The historical recreations in the university were quite sterile. Here somehow the industrial re-inhabiting of the form of this ancient form with industrial materials actually feels really fruitful and light and kind of works well.
If you think about the surviving early Christian or even kind of early medieval basilica churches, often what produces their particular kind of poetic or pathetic effect is the simplicity of their construction, often using recovered materials with quite sort of severe restrictions on available techniques, and then in terms of the forms and the spaces, very simple. What these buildings do is to deploy these quite rudimentary, quite basic industrial materials in the creation of the same sort of simplicity. It seems probably that the best church out of this sequence is the one that we haven't been to, which is the one at Laudarello, which is larger. It has a kind of octagonal form or something. Is that right?
It has this huge octagonal lantern / tower, which is almost the full width of the church, and it has a separate octagonal, like 10, 12-sided baptistery next to it. And the octagonal tower has got this very rich facade, which is a mixture of brick and concrete in a sort of panelled grid with very highly articulated but very fine concrete struts. It's incredibly North London.
Yes.
style.
Yes, I can imagine like several of the design units at my the university I work at producing this project now.
Yeah, no problem. Except they don't do churches, but apart from that, it looks really lovely. It's a bit difficult. He's not mega highly documented, Michelucci. And we haven't. There's really one project that people know about, and we haven't talked about it yet.
Yes, although we are about to get there. Maybe we'll just say one other thing. So the one which we have been to, the church in Pistoia, yeah, inside it's very dark, it's very high. Although we've talked about it, as we compared it to a basilica, it doesn't actually have the basilica form in the sense there are no aisles. It's a hall church, but it does have it has the roof, this truss roof detail that makes it instantly recognizable even without those. It has these are sort of two blocks set with a gap between them in the walls, which lets through these little points of light.
Yeah, they are windows. They're slit. These very, very thin slit windows.
And then up at the top, the roof truss up in the roof, as you look at it, it has the form of a timber truss, but is in fact made of reinforced concrete, which has been cast against timber, so that it kind of has a board marked effect, and the edges of it are slightly chamfered, and it gives the whole thing this unusual quality which looks a little bit organic. It has a little bit of the look of like timber that hasn't been squared off properly, maybe, like slightly that kind of construction, which is not quite roundwood but isn't quite squared off either, which is quite, the sort of a thing that you find in vernacular sort of peasant architecture. And it's only a small detail, but it does have quite an interesting quality, and it becomes extremely important and really becomes an element, the expressive power of which is his real focus for lots and lots of the buildings of the period to follow.
And in fact, over the two side chapels, entrances to the two side chapels is a much more...
Yeah, more like a sort of A frame or something.
Yeah, it feels more like something that belongs in the language of concrete modernism. And the members aren't of a continuous thickness because they're cast, so they get thinner as sort of expressing the form. And as you say, that is like wood, but it is also like... It also expresses somehow engineering forces, like a sort of optimized machine, or expresses those forces in nature that, make tree trunks a certain thickness as they grow to resist force. It sort of is both high-tech and organic. But overwhelmingly, this church is hyper-historic in its tone, although not super-duper any particular period.
Yes, it's historic in its tone, but in a completely abstracted way. It's incredible. The language is absolutely abstract. And this, I should say, to kind of point the way a bit to something we'll talk about in the bonus, is quintessentially rationalist. This idea of drawing on history, but in a language which is absolutely abstract. And that's something which I think kind of takes forward that tradition into the post-war.
In a way, it should be called essentialist, because it's both essential function and essential type or something.
So these church projects, and then he's also doing lots of other stuff which we're not talking about because we haven't seen it, but they last until the late 50s. Around that time, he was relieved of his duties as a professor at the university on account of being too old, and that's this sort of rather enjoyable irony, because in fact all of the most significant projects were still ahead of him at that point, and really are creations of his so the church, his most famous project, which we're going to talk about, started on site in 1960, at which point he would have been 69.
So in his 60s, he's doing loads of work. Lots of buildings, lots of big buildings. At first, when you glance through the catalogue, it's hard to discern a clear theme. There are buildings that fit within the conventions of post-war Italian modernist vernacular, or whatever you want to call it. Lots of sort of. There's this huge tower in Livorno.
Yeah, I've been to that. I think it's like a cross shape or something in the upper parts in plan.
The shape is super complicated.
And it has a plinth as well. It's like a plinth with it has like a tall plinth element at the bottom, and then it kind of becomes more of a tower going up.
It's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 arms, but they're all irregular. And the facade is irregular. In some patches it's concrete, and in some patches it's flat. It's this really strange shape. He's drawn it as this almost this kind of craggy shard of rock, but it doesn't read like that at all in terms of the building. And then and there's more sort of low ones. He's a dab hand at the fine concrete frame with rough stone infill, ashlar stone infill. Going to, in a way, he's sort of doing like really nice 5 points architecture. In a lot of them, they're kind of they're using the grid. They're essentially all concrete. They're all concrete. They're all dominoes. But he plays a lot more with the facade, and a lot of them have a bit of historicism. But you begin to get more and more big internal columns, which start to have strange beams coming out of them at funny angles. And it really does sort of grow on a gradient from those quite tentative historical beginnings in the churches.
There's another church we haven't mentioned where, there are concrete columns rather than just trusses, which as they get up then flare out and create almost
they become a sort of fan of
like
struts.
A fan. Yeah, and they sort of support what almost looks like a vault above them, but only it's sort of a two-dimensional shape.
And there's this project, the Osteria Gamboro Rosso, or something like that, which has got quite a free plan and has got these nests of trusses going all the way down it, which have got a much more bio/techno form. They kind of go down into big concrete feet like Corb's Unité, but then above that they become irregular triangulated concrete trusses with sort of notched articulated joints. It's quite kind of difficult to describe. It's still quite regular, but he's definitely seeing what you can do with irregular trusses. And there's unbuilt proposals in that form as well. Well, there are some that are a lot more funky, let's put it like that. And I've got more of these trusses and are starting to have almost... He sort of flirts with proto-postmodernism, I suppose. Or like Sterling-y late...
That kind of fragmentation, a sort of language of fragmentation.
And also kind of richer ornament, but in a geometric language.
So I think we should tell the story of his most celebrated building, which he began in 1960, and which is... I mean, do you want to tell the story? It's
Well, the trouble is I only know it from being told it by someone who was quite drunk and was very, very old.
I've been told the story by other people as well. The story goes like this. So there's the Autostrada A11, which is the motorway of the sun, I think it is called. It comes down from the north and it goes down to... It's the one that you take down to go on holiday. You can go down to the coast.
And through this industrial plain around Florence.
But it was a controversial project because it had they had poor standards of health and safety on site and had killed an improbably large number of workers during its construction. And as a result, it became necessary to expiate this disgrace through the construction of a church in penance. And the church was a project. There was an existing design.
I think, in fact, the Pope called for them to do it.
Yeah. Oh, that sounds very proper. That's the kind of thing you're meant to do. So it was being paid for by, was it Pirelli?
Pirelli, yeah.
Yeah, who actually had built the
who we
roadway.
think of as naughty
calendars,
and tyres, but they were in fact a sort of all-encompassing everything industrial conglomerates.
And they had a design, but the design wasn't very good, and at some point it was so bad that it had to be abandoned because of sort of a general public outcry.
Well, I think a critical outcry.
At a point at which the foundations had already been completed. And it's at this point, all of these things, I've got to say, make the extraordinary design carried through by Michelucci more improbable. But it was after this that he came on board and made this new proposal for the church, which is the one which was constructed, which is the rather wonderfully named San Giovanni Battista dell'Autostrada, which is St. John the Baptist of the motorway, and which is reached from the motorway.
It's kind of in a giant traffic island.
There is, it's directly next to the headquarters, the regional headquarters of the motorway company, and it's next to some sort of motorway restaurants. Well, I've been there twice. Once on bicycles, which was rather hairy, and the first time I got a train to the local station, which is a place called Sesto Fiorentino, and then I walked through some fields, and then I sort of ran across a couple of roundabouts, and eventually I got there, and I had to jump over a fence. But the project is very much a church of the motorway for the motorway, and the idea is that it's a tent. You read this metaphor much less strongly from the outside than you do from the inside, and this is expressed through the form of the roof, which is cast concrete, but which is this kind of draped surface.
Well, on the outside, what you see is a curving, almost sort of Ronchon-esque wall, but in rough stone, and a roof that juts up in a curve, like the curve of a tent, I suppose, which is in green bronze. And the form is very hard to read as you go round it. It's one of these, even more so than like the Berlin Philharmonic or something. It's a form which is complex, but sort of mountainous.
It's sort of mountainous, and it's sort of curled round on itself. It doesn't create the metaphor is not really legible from there, and it kind of rises up to this point, which has a big cross on it, very appropriately. On the inside, the roof and the columns which support it are all this very rough cast concrete, cast against wooden boards, and the roof is drooping. It's drooping, and what seems to be this kind of tent fabric is coming down from this very tall, dark recess right in the top of the roof space. The poles which support it are these incredibly organic, branching, tree-like forms. They're completely irrational. They've taken on an entirely organic sort of form of expression, branching outwards and getting smaller and smaller and kind of joining into one another, with this effect which is, extremely sculptural and kind of persuasively organic. You feel them kind of tapering up to this point which they're supporting, and there's like a suitably sort of political metaphor for it. It's meant to be redolent of the tribes of Israel or whatever in their tents in the desert. That's the justification, but really it is a bravura demonstration of what had become possible in the use of reinforced concrete at that point. I mean, in all of these, he'd obviously been working through the potential of the material in all of these projects over the previous 15 years, and he at that point had a sense of what it was actually possible to create. Do you want to say anything about the way the plan works, which is quite kind of hard?
I want to talk about it. Okay, I'll kind of describe going through it. So as you enter, there's a front with some crappy bronze artworks that they'd done for the old church, and you enter a hall which is long, thin, rectangular, and you have a sense on your right-hand side that there's this bit of curved roof, and there are these bronze plaques going along, and there are these concrete struts coming out across, and there's a glass courtyard on your left, and there's a way down to this Baptistery, which is another amazing space, which we'll describe in a bit. As you get to the end, you turn right, and you turn into an amazing hall. The hall is all there are sort of four materials. There is this very rough cast concrete in situ, which is present in the upper bits of the walls. This roof, which is like a drooping fabric, but it's not like a taut Fry Otto fabric. It really is like if you had a sheet on a pole and you drooped it down almost vertically. So it's vertiginous. The way it disappears up into this dark upper croft, held up by these kind of fingers of concrete tree. The ground is this strange, like almost blood red marble, cut in patterns which are, the only way I could describe it like is if you kind of cut through a tuna steak and you've got these curves.
Yeah, the joints are quite big though. They're quite kind of like fat joints between them. So
but there's this red, like bright red marble, and then there's curving walls of rough knocked together stone, which are the base of the walls. And the other material is glass. There's a huge, also not particularly brilliant, stained glass window of Christ on one side, and on the other side there are this mesh of windows which at sunset cast the shadows of the trucks onto the altar. So the motorway's up at the sort of first story, and the shadows of the trucks gets projected onto the Christ, which is very impressive when you see it, especially as it in a good sunset it's like blood red light.
Yeah. So the main space is this amazing actual church space, but there are also a complex of other sacred spaces around it. I mean, it occurs to me that is a classic, although the arrangement is very unconventional, that is a classic kind of narthex space, that you have a kind of a hall that you go into before you go into the main hall.
And in fact, plan-wise, it's more similar to ones where you've got a long narthex and a long main body of the church, but the long narthex is, it's on the long edge. So you approach at one end. Although that's true, like the first, second, and third point has got to be how extraordinary and unusual. And this isn't just he's just done a few strange columns.
It feels incredibly
no
tall
wall is
inside.
Straight.
Yeah, it feels on the inside you have this incredible sense of height and darkness above you. The way in which the columns, I guess partly accentuated by their tapering, also by the complexity of these like branchings. You don't know where to look. You kind of can look everywhere, and then everything disappears into this sort of dusty blackness up in the invisible pitch of the space, and it's extremely dramatic.
And then after you've gone into the main bit, you've got various options. Tucked into corners are places you can either go up a narrow winding staircase through round a sort of seam of this curving wall onto a gallery which goes around sort of 2.5 sides, or sort of 2 sides of the main space, and is part of the separation between the lobby and the main body of the church. And to lower level, there's this snaking route round into the Baptistery.
Yeah, the Baptistery is also quite an amazing space, and it becomes in the Baptistery, it's really all about a processional route. That the Baptistery, the circulation is a spiral, which brings you down, to the font which is in the centre. And so
you
it
start
creates
in the main body, and then there's this tight, very dark, oblong room that the families queue up with the babies to be baptized, and then from there you go in this very, like, it gets narrower and narrower and pinches down in a pinch point of dark corridor, and then you come into this roundish room. The ceiling is like a hand of concrete, which supports a dome above it, and the room spirals down into a font in the middle, and suddenly it's light as well. So you pass through this incredibly narrow space and burst out into this light room, spiral down. The children are baptized, and then they come out another way, and as they go out they pass this huge window into a tiny courtyard which has got 2 or 3 olive trees and is very brightly lit. And I would hope you'd pick up some symbolism in this path. You are born into the church and brought into the light of the garden, and it's not cod. It doesn't like. It's quite symbolically heavy-handed, but it doesn't resort to. There's no imagery, and it's not at all kitsch. No one would say any moment of that's kitsch. It's really.
I think something. Just returning to the main body of the church, I think if you're trying to get an image of what it feels like, it is a bit like one of those faces of those enormous dams. If you think like those enormous dams built by Roosevelt, for example, where you have this enormous, like huge surfaces with this relentless board marking of the concrete, but that in some miraculous way it's convex, it's on top of you, and it's kind of being supported by these like trees. So you take the
outside of the Hoover Dam, turn it upside down, mirror it with another one, and support it with enormous concrete trees, and it really is that steep. The angle is like way going up.
And it's right on top of you.
I mean, it's obviously not as big as the Hoover Dam, but it's big on the inside.
It feels enormous.
It's not small.
Yeah, it feels enormous.
Big, heavy, and fat. Yeah, it's quite a thing. I don't know how good it is. When I've been there, when there's been a service going on, I wouldn't say it's super well attended. It's kind of like you do kind of have to cross a motorway to get to it. There were people, sort of 30, 40 people there for a service on an off day.
But I do think, yeah, it does. I've been there a few times, and it's all. There's always someone doing the cleaning, but there's not very much life going on otherwise.
I was there on a Wednesday when there was a service. 30 or 40, mainly old women. It's got a slightly funny shape, I think, for actually doing worship, which is that the holy end is on one of the long edges, so it's much wider than it's deep. And theoretically, the congregation sits in this raft of seats which start by the altar and go back underneath the gallery. As with a lot of these things, there's a bit of a problem that it's a little... I mean, people can have different opinions about church in the round. It's very Vatican II. I think it's difficult if you don't have the mass. Because you look very... it's got terribilità. The space is much more powerful than the congregation. It's really cool. It's well worth a visit. It's very easy to get to. I mean, in spite of the terrible stories we've given, it is easy to get to from Florence.
It's not hard. You just, you just look at Google Maps. It did work in the end. It just felt a bit bizarre walking through these fields being barked at by dogs.
You sure don't have to bat away the madding crowds to get there. The other thing I wanted to say is a bit before this time, there's a picture of him sitting next to one of the very late Michelangelo Pietas, which we talked about in the third Michelangelo episode, where the Virgin is kind of emerging out of very rough stone, holding this almost Gothic Christ, which is also very rough, which is both a symbol of late style, which they were both doing, but also of this God emerging from rough, asymmetric, hard to read stone, which is not only not full of the symbols or of the sort of conventional masses of churches. I mean, they're all there. All the components are there. They've just been quite distorted. It's also not really full of the signifiers of modernism. It's quite an eccentric piece in its time. I mean, it was an age of eccentric bits, but...
I think you could definitely... I feel like this is a project which in some way kind of diagnoses the ambiguous position of these types of modernistic, spiritually infused, sort of sculptural, masterworks, but which also, although they're incredibly successful in some ways, they're also on this very uncertain terrain. So the fact that it does very persuasively analogize and convey all of these key elements of the doctrine, of the stories, it makes very resonant and and very kind of effective the journey through baptism into the community of the church. But then it's marooned on a traffic island, which feels like it's quite, modernity is just on the other side of the glass, and like the kind of rushing waters or whatever, in some way the trucks are kind of bearing away, even at that moment, the world which it's still striving to be a part of. That actually even in 1963, its best days are almost behind it at the moment that it's completed.
Well, I suppose it's worth saying this is exactly at the point of Vatican II, isn't it? I'd love to hear about Catholic, if anyone's got experiences with this church in a religious context, and whether it works. It works very well as an architectural experience. It feels sublime, which it's very much trying to be. It feels loved, and it feels like a spiritually infused landscape, the church. It feels like more of a landscape than a building in some ways on the interior. I'm not a worshipper. The bits of it, there's some bits which are obviously, like the art, the representational Christian art in it doesn't work with the building. There's the huge stained glass Christ, which is very period in colour and with this sort of scratchy drawing in metal. But in a way, the way they don't integrate is the way that the design of the church is very radical and was in a period of radical church building. I don't know. I don't know how they work as religious buildings.
But in a way, that doesn't even really matter. For me, the real pathos of the building is the Baptistery, which has this. It's almost like a motorway off-ramp for the enormous volume of young women who are going to be bearing their babies to come and be baptized into the body of the church, but there are none.
Yeah, well,
They're not
I mean,
coming.
that it was built kind of,
or rather, they've stopped coming.
It was built at the peak.
Yeah,
It was built in this massive baby boom, which slowly declined, and even more so than most places, there was a huge baby boom, and it was longer and bigger than most places, and its decline has been longer and more persistent.
I think what kind of hangs over it, or there's something particular about its siting, which brings all of those things together, and which seems to kind of continuously put it on display. I wanted to say one thing about the place of this building in architectural history, which is that it has a funny relationship to Robert Venturi, who in his first edition, so there are these two quotations. In the first edition of Complexity and Contradiction, he makes this offhand swipe at the building and says, he compares it unfavourably to a building by Alvar Aalto. He says, on the one hand, the Aalto Church represents a justifiable expressionism different from the willful picturesqueness of the haphazard structure and spaces of Giovanni Michelucci's recent church for the Autostrada. That was edition 1. In edition 2, he introduced this text. I have visited Giovanni Michelucci's church of the Autostrada since writing these words, and I now realise it is an extremely beautiful and effective building. I am therefore sorry I made this unsympathetic comparison. So it's kind of, I think it reflects well on Venturi to publish the kind of climb down.
Well, I can see why you'd think that. Like, looking at it on paper, it's incredibly willful and almost contrived and obstinate, but it does hang together. He pulls it off. A lot of the buildings that are like this, there's no building that's really like this, but a lot of the buildings that are kind of crap. This one isn't. This one's brilliant. It's fab.
So we don't have time to talk about them, but there are a few other churches which also belong to this period. So he did one in, there are various ones. I think there's one in San Marino. I think it's one of the big modern buildings in that part of the world. The one which I think is worth dwelling on is the project in a village called Longarone, which had suffered a terrible disaster in 1963, where, I think a landslide went into a dam and caused an enormous release of water, which killed a very large number of people, in the hundreds. And he built a memorial church for them, and it's in the same sort of language of this, using the same materials. It has on the roof this quite novel idea, which is almost like an amphitheatre on the roof. The village is in the mountains, as you'd imagine from the dam, and from the amphitheatre, which they later would use for kind of outdoor masses and this kind of thing, you command this amazing view of the scenery around it. Neither of us have been to it. It looks like a pretty extraordinary thing, and it would be very interesting to make the trip. If any of you listeners have been, it would be nice to know what you made of it.
It kind of it's this massive bowl surrounded by ramps, is what it looks like from the outside, and then inside it is very much it's a bowl amphitheatre in terms of the body of the church, with another one sitting on top. And it's also got a sort of funky baptistery to the side, and it looks kind of amazing. And it sits in this bowl landscape of, I'm not sure if it's the Dolomites. It's kind of that sort of like very craggy hill in mountainside. And it's got yet another amphitheatre outside, I think. I think it's got 3. His buildings are... Their style is... It takes quotations from all over the place and is... They take quotations from all over the place. Most of them are not that wild, but they are idiosyncratic. And rather like we were talking about the liberty architects of his youth, had this approach to sort of, they were incredibly, grotesque and heavy-handed with ornament, but they would take from anywhere. And the trick is to be able to blend, one thing for massing, and to be able to steal whole cloth from all these, but to make something new. And he is doing that in a completely different style, but it feels like it's still in a continuous tradition.
Yeah, it has. There's a synthesis which has to go on, which distinguishes it from the way in which later postmodernists would express their quotation, where things remain as fragments within a somewhat fragmentary collage. Here, they're very much knitted into this organic unity.
I think it might be worth saying later on, he goes on to collage some stuff that looks rather like archigram. Or other... there's the building in Milan, which has got this sort of, all these like funny feet in a kind of barrel coming out of the bottom and a funny tin roof. And after that, he starts building... He kind of keeps drawing these wild, curvaceous concrete things, but also starts experimenting with frames of steel joists.
Yeah, so the steel, I think we should move on to... So the churches we've been talking about are projects of his 70s, but as he moves towards...
His 80s and 90s.
His 80s. I'm not sure he builds anything much in his 90s, but in his 80s, he's still building very much, and he moves into a new style again, which, as you say, is the new ingredient is steel. And I think there's 2 projects really worth talking about. Maybe I'll just say something quickly about the Villa Strozzi, which is a ruined... It's in Florence, isn't it?
Outside in the country, yeah.
And it's a kind of ruined classical... It was a kind of ruined classical like orangery or like house or something, and which they wanted to turn into a venue, and it's in a park. I went there and it was very bizarre. It was raining very hard, and there were people doing some kind of weird meditation practice. And then I walked down the hill, and then at the bottom there were people having a party, and then in the middle there was like a homeless guy cooking something on a camping gas, and someone was doing some like drumming or something, and then everything was like brought together by the rain, and it was a complete dream landscape. It was very bizarre. Down at the bottom there was like an enormous party going on, which I think was like a children's party in a venue. So the elements of the building are these like existing masonry elements, and then there are all of these steel and glass insertions, including becoming a bit of a trope, an amphitheatre on the roof, which is a sort of partially, sort of like a cinema, or looks like a cinema or theatre. But everything is expressed very much as a language of like fragments which are interweaving in a very playful way through the existing masonry forms. And it looks a lot like quite a lot of sort of student projects of the 90s or whatever.
Yeah, we've kind of omitted what he said about his buildings. And in his early career, he wasn't too doctrinaire. He becomes into slightly... There's a certain amount of mystic mumbo-jumbo of... or like, no doubt, very interesting kind of Louis Kahn, you can't finish however many kilometers of earth with this much marble. And he sort of talks about the mass of people communicating with the stars in amphitheaters and things, and it becomes very spiritually the forest, the stars, these things with legs.
It's investigated through drawing a great deal as well. A certain amount was published around the time of his death, and quite a lot of his drawings were published then, which are these black ink, very fine ink line drawings, but with this sort of relentless organic thing. It looks like sort of Russian vine covering over and becoming these organic shapes, which become either like urban megastructures or the roof forms of enormous churches.
They're very much more expressionist than the work. I mean, the work shows, like, weirdly, it shows liberty and expressionist influences, but isn't at all like either of those things.
I've got a quote for him, which maybe is, I think, doesn't clarify anything, but gives a sense sort of the presentation. He says, "Maybe this is the architect's happiness, not in having built one's masterpiece, but rather in having given a sense of unity to that which we have built, which is not a wall, but a thought that is not born from our individual will, but from what nature has deposited in our spirit, slowly, in time. It is not the kind of pleasure that arises from a vague sense of self-satisfaction, but the happiness that matures through trials of discouragement and moments of doubt in one's abilities. It is a state of mind which the project and the architecture are less important than the discovery in ourselves of a light that can illuminate everything from tree to animal, so intensely that we are sure of having discovered another dimension." It's sort of this funny text, the interview, because the point of arrival is continuously kind of growing onwards into the light slightly beyond the reach of one's grasp. I'm not sure I ever really get to a point where I quite understand what he's talking about. The design process it's intensely felt, it's intuited, it's clearly painstakingly worked through, but it doesn't draw on, or it doesn't rely rather on a kind of codified set of principles. It's something which is produced endogenously within the
And he
process.
never had a house style. I mean, he did a few buildings in this concrete morphic style, but at the same time he was perfectly capable of having things which look much more conventional or being sort of brutalist. I don't think that's just because some of them were an earner and some of them were spiritually important buildings. I think he was always willing to experiment with styles.
Yes, and I think kind of inspired by whatever the particular narrative or context suggested.
And I think he was, into his 80s, a jobbing architect as well. I mean, I don't mean that in perhaps a jobbing. I mean, he was running a real architectural practice that was doing real work.
So can we talk about I think the place to finish is with this really amazing late building. So this was built in 1973, at which point he was in his early 80s, in a Tuscan town called Colle di Valdelsa, which is, it's not a very large place.
Yeah, I said it was kind of like the Tuscan equivalent of Billericay.
Yeah, and it's the local bank. It's the Monte dei Paschi. So it's like Billericay, Barclays or whatever.
Yeah, Halifax.
But it's quite a thing. The building, the thing which you notice first and which is most apparent is this red painted steel frame, which looks a little bit like the red oxide painted steel frame under construction. When you encounter it, at the end furthest away from you is an existing quite tall stone gable of a building with a pointed roof. And at that far end, the steel frame more or less resembles the gable, but as it moves towards you, it sort of expands outward and seems to split apart. It's a little bit like it's kind of unfolding and sticking its elbows out until it's reaching out over the space around you. The entire building, I should say, the most obvious thing about it is that it's hovering off the ground. There is nothing at ground level at all. What you see is a covered square paved in stone, and the building is supported on these series of I forget, like 8 or 10 big steel pin-jointed feet, which resemble those of some of those great Industrial Revolution buildings. I'm thinking particularly of the Galerie des Machines in the French Expo of 1870 or whatever it is, and which powerfully express this very precise like coming down onto the surface of the earth of this industrial object, but which actually is, you know, also seemingly very irrational. I don't know how organic it seems necessarily. It seems more fragmented than organic.
One big thing we haven't talked about much is that it's this truss of red painted girders with raw stone footings, and in it are suspended these sort of porter cabins underneath a big roof, and it's like a giant treehouse. And you climb up these kind of like gantry staircases, which are all steel, and you go into, and in the top there's a giant treehouse, which is the bank.
So they're like, they look like hovering porter cabins. They've got these sort of horizontally expressed windows.
They're kind of made of like shipping container.
The materiality is a little bit
tin.
off, because I think that the cladding is actually bronze. I think so.
It feels like shipping container, crinkly tin.
Yeah, but they're these slightly luxury shipping containers. But yeah, as you say, you go up the stairs, and it does feel like you're going up into a tree house or something, or and the bank is right at the top.
Yeah, and it's in this pitch roof giant treehouse room, which goes down almost to a point. It's a bit like, the Hong Kong Bank in Hong Kong, HSBC in Hong Kong, where this kind of high tech ideal, which I suppose is a completely Corbusian ideal, that you lift the building off the ground and provide this public space. But where the Hong Kong Shanghai Bank in Hong Kong is in this super dense, super urban zone, this is, like on the edge of a town of 30,000, 25,000 people. It's kind of slightly historic town. And there's obviously nothing. I imagine kids skateboard under it occasionally. Actually, I've never been very convinced by these underneath building spaces.
Birds shit on it a lot.
Birds shit on it,
I can tell you that. It needs a lot of sweeping.
But it's a funny. It feels like a completely different sort of project, doesn't it? It feels like.
Yes, it feels like he's suddenly like, the previous ones are very much part of a late modernistic language, which is striving for the ability to express meaning, but which is doing it with these sort of plain, heavy, austere materials, like authentic concrete, stone, bronze, these materials which are serious. And here it's as if he's really discovered some of the kind of fun and slight ironic edge of the architecture of postmodernity, albeit kind
of in the sort of like 60s British avant-garde almost. It's not like a historicized Pomo building.
No, it's completely unhistoricized. I mean, it's actually much more, it's kind of high tech as well.
Yeah.
But equally, then it's a high tech which is expressed in a materiality which is not a million miles away from Santa Maria Novella station, I mean, on the inside of the bank, it's all fine stones again.
It's still marble, rough cut stone.
It's the marble treehouse.
But the treehouse does feel light as well. It does really. There's something about the light in it and the way that the pitch is really big, but at the edges of the room it's really low. It's really cool. It's a very jolly thing to have in a city. Banks don't have to be that serious. They are just commercial. It's just about money. I mean, it's quite nice for them to be a bit funny.
It's funny as well because, like, it being, I don't think this is an Italian thing, but you have to go through this sort of like double or triple airlock thing to get into it.
Yeah, you have to put your bank card in and then take it out, and then they puts you into a giant airlock. Well, they had a lot of problems in the years of lead, didn't they?
But then then you get into this place which feels again like a fantasy. I mean, I feel like many of Michelucci's post-war buildings, they feel like the civic monuments of an amazing country that doesn't exist. Yeah. And I'd kind of like to live there.
Yeah. It's sort of expensive and frivolous and light and jokey. It's not great. This building isn't great, by the way, I don't think. I don't think it's bad. I'd be very happy to have one around. I wish there was a lot more of them. This stuff is cool, but it's not a great building.
I would say that the decisions, the fundamental basis for his decisions, which is that we have to liberate this big plaza downstairs, is just fundamentally flawed. But the experience of it is really delightful. I think it's good for all the old ladies to go up a few
There are loads
few
of
flights
nutty
of
buildings
stairs. Yeah.
in small town Italy, particularly small town northern Italy. It's got all these like whack 70s, like extraordinarily outlandish organizing a cycle trip. There's no difficulty in finding like a cool building every 10k.
Yes, and then I mean that sort of is more or less where the career comes to a close.
He has a sort of late speculative career doing more and more wacky proposals, most of which don't get built. Before that bank, there's a bigger sort of civic town hall, which is quite funny because it's got both hung boxes in a sort of steel lattice and another building next to it, which is wiggly concrete with a partial wiggly concrete roof and a partial steel roof.
It shows that you need practice.
Yeah.
You can't hit it out the park every time.
Yeah, and I don't think he's definitely not a 4-episode. He's not Michelangelo. But because he's doing all these different things, he does occasionally provide stuff that are real gems to come across. You're really happy. I was really happy every time we went to one of his buildings. And I thought the motorway church is quite famous. Probably partly for being in complexity and contradiction. But a lot of the other buildings are real delights, actually. You often, and quite often you'd go past the building that looked a bit more fun than the others, and it was one of his.
Yeah, very local as well. Like it's very, very much around Tuscany and a little bit further afield, but not much.
A bit further north.
So yeah, well, the curtain comes down in 1990. They were all basically planning the big party because he was going to be 100. There's a biographical essay written by Francisco Dalco where he says, he opens the essay by saying, Giovanni Michelucci was born in Pistoia on January the 2nd, 1891. As I present these pages, we enter the year that marks the threshold of his century-long life. Michelucci is still active and involved in his practice daily, from the peaceful setting of his home in the Tuscan hills of Fiesole overlooking Florence. And then there's a footnote which says, when I wrote these pages, it seemed obvious to note that Michelucci was about to turn 100 years of age. Unfortunately, my written salutation, as well as the best wishes that I offered him personally when we discussed this essay, have gone unheard. Even at the decisive moment of his existence, Michelucci, almost immodestly, confirmed his own idiosyncrasy in the face of prescribed events and fixed appointments.
Yeah, it's very sweet.
It's nice. It's a nice way of phrasing it.
And he's left a legacy of all these great, lovely buildings scattered about the place. No one's copied him. I don't think it would be a good idea.
Yeah, and I feel like the missing component of the story is something about the embodied knowledge in the practice as well. Then that's what I don't really know. You can look at the buildings and you can see these materials and elements developing through a series of projects and the inherent possibilities of them becoming more and more explored and more and more daringly innovated on and attempted, and that must reflect like a sort of a body of disciplinary knowledge within the actual structure of the office, which obviously we don't really know anything about.
Also backed up by the construction culture, the culture of the industry at that time, from probably the mid-50s to the mid-80s. Italy went through an amazing economic boom. We don't think of it as a powerhouse, but there were all these fantastic, even as the government was completely sclerotic, incompetent, busy shooting each other, there were all these tycoons whizzing around, sort of tech companies of the day, and they were just building like crazy. And building fun buildings as well. They were a lot more interesting. The sort of general background style was a lot more interesting than it is here for a start. And so there were loads of people around who could do daring, intricate and extraordinary things in concrete and steel without it seeming like this implausible, impossible thing that you're going to have to design out. You can just tell people, I want to do this amazing, curvy, in situ cast concrete, and they'd be like, righto, let's get to it. We've done stuff like that. And that, sadly, I think has gone. And in fact, it really went in the 90s. There hasn't been... I mean, obviously, there are interesting buildings and there are good contemporary Italian architects. But that world of just churning out all these exciting buildings. There's so many interesting buildings in Italy dating to,
Yeah,
that sort of
50s, 60s.
50s, 60s, 70s.
Yeah.
I think we'll look back on it as a great era. He is only one character amongst many, and I'm sure we'll deal with more of them as time goes on.
Yeah, there's a whole series of them that I don't really know a lot about, but who kind of lived through the same period. Gio Ponti, Ettore Sottsass, these people,
Portuguese.
Paolo Portuguese, who go in radically different and also very they're all idiosyncratic. You can give them that. Right. Well, I think we should kind of let ourselves be swept away on a tide of nostalgia.
Yeah, as we go once more into that dark night.
Thanks very much for listening. This is the first thing we've recorded for a little while.
I'm not really with it. A bit ill at the moment. Too much living high.
We very much appreciate all of you who listen, who rate and review on iTunes or any podcast store. That's extremely helpful and does a lot to introduce the show to other people. You remember you can follow us on social media at @about_buildings, where we'll be posting pictures as
Make life
always.
easier. We've got a very exciting thing now, which is that we've got Matt helping us with the editing.
Yes. Oh yeah. No, I've been waiting to say this. Our editor is Matthew Lloyd Roberts.
Yeah, it's very good.
Yes.
Just started, and hopefully this is all part of the plan for us getting on a more regular schedule with the bonuses as we get ready to hitting that Patreon milestone.
Yeah, which I think is going to happen.
You can all force us into becoming regular and efficient.
So if you want more, and we've got a really good bonus for this one. We're going to be talking about in more detail some of the really peculiar and rather fascinating tendencies within Italian fascist architecture. You can get access to the bonus material at patreon.com/about_buildings, where for $3 a month you can receive bonus material.
Almost another episode for every episode. They're a bit shorter. We've had a couple of good ones actually. I thought they're not like we're slightly getting into our stride with some of the early ones, but
yeah, lots to recommend it. And please get in touch if you've got thoughts. It's always nice to hear from you. Thanks a lot to everyone who's emailed. I think I've got back to everyone. We're about buildings and cities at gmail.com, and you can find all our information and everything at aboutbuildingsandcities.org.
Good night.
The way is long, the light is short.